Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining. Maybe you're watching this recorded afterwards. We'll give people about 30 seconds here to join. But again, welcome to our Getting Started with reCAPTCHA Enterprise kind of onboarding session. Look forward to kind of explaining the journey to you all, answering your questions, and engaging with you all. So let's give people about 30 seconds more here before we go ahead and get started, because we've got a fairly packed agenda and then want to leave enough time for Q&A. Perfect. Well, it looks like a few more people have joined, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to your Getting Started with reCAPTCHA Enterprise Onboarding session. For the sake of today's call, the mute button, not necessarily using the platform we're addressing here, but throughout the conversation today, please do go ahead and ask questions. On your YouTube panel on the right-hand side, you'll see a panel to either ask questions. Feel free to let us know now, where you're joining from, kind of where you're at with your either reCAPTCHA journey or throughout the entire presentation. Feel free to use that chat bar to ask questions, both either on the topic we're on or just kind of in general. From a format perspective, what we'll do is Kendrick and myself are the presenters today, kind of from your reCAPTCHA customer success and sales team. What we'll do in terms of the session goal, and kind of we'll talk about the flow first, is Kendrick and I will kind of go through the presentation. We're going to kind of bounce back and forth based off our certain areas of expertise, kind of talk through reCAPTCHA in general, kind of resources, but also at the end, we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So please feel free to ask any questions there. So, that's kind of the admin stuff. So let's get into the actual goals of today's session. So you can see there, we kind of have 4 foundational areas that we'd like to cover today and make sure that you're kind of equipped to get started with reCAPTCHA, knowing kind of some of the basics, basically the who, what, when, where, why of where to go to ask questions, how to ask questions, and even the personas to ask questions too. So the first component of today is going to be kind of talking about the key phases of implementing reCAPTCHA Enterprise. So Kendrick will cover that section, but more or less kind of understanding kind of, the out of the box, kind of where to get started, how to jumpstart kind of that implementation process. So Kendrick will walk through that phase. The next is kind of the knowing how to get help with your technical questions or issues. Like any products, knowing where to go if you have an issue, if you have a question to ask, in terms of documentation, where to look that up. We'll kind of navigate you through that process. The third part here is kind of learning about the resources that are available to you at any time. So with these, it's kind of the ad hoc or at your own disposal resources. So where you could go to get enabled from a learning perspective, where to ask questions on the community, things like that. So kind of making sure you're equipped with a resource guide for you able to tackle the questions on your own. And then the last, we'll kind of talk a bit about kind of how to get connected with other peers, experts, people like Kendrick and myself, how to engage in the community in general. So that's kind of the lay of the land of today's session. Keep those kind of 4 goals in mind as we go. So the first thing I kind of want to touch on here is kind of our digital channels here within reCAPTCHA. So the first we'll talk about is documentation. Whether you're getting a new car and you're opening the owner's manual, whether maybe it's a new phone or a new computer, or with a SaaS product, opening kind of that user guide, having kind of the documentation at your disposal can go a long ways. So with this, I'll actually click in and go show you a little bit about reCAPTCHA Enterprise documentation. As you can see here, it's kind of highlighted for many different learning type of ways, right? Some of us learn more from reading, something like a guide or an overview. Some of us like videos, seeing how things are done, best practices, kind of some setup in minutes. This is a great resource in general as like an overview, but as we can see here, we dive into different foundational areas. So guides themselves, kind of a very high level overview, potentially a version comparison, quick start, migrating from reCAPTCHA, protecting endpoints, protecting user accounts. Again, those guides, use those kind of as the framework for typical foundational questions, maybe setup, security type issues, kind of the protection side of it. So the guides themselves are very thorough. You can go walk through one, I guess. The overview, we're new. As you can see here, it's very thorough documentation on kind of the setup, how it works, some of the basics, as you can see here, can dive deeper. But I think that the key here with the documentation is knowing that it all exists on this landing page, and there's multiple different flavors of how to get this information in your hands. There's also references, some potentially questions about a client library or REST API or RPC API. There's also resources on the right about pricing, quota limits, release notes, and we'll cover a bit more of that later. But I think the key takeaway here is knowing that all this documentation exists in a nice little package here on the Google Cloud reCAPTCHA Enterprise page. And at the end and after this conversation, we'll share all these links with you. So you feel free to not be kind of rushing to copy and paste this URL at the moment. So that's kind of the first component of like digital channels for your support. So the reCAPTCHA events, you're actually on the first or a pilot of these. So in the future, keep an eye on for further events, things like meetups, things like webinars, potentially additional events on kind of adoption topics or other functional areas of the product itself. So keep an eye there. You're actually on this today, so it's coming soon. As of 6 minutes ago, it's not soon anymore. So the next thing is the community. So I'll touch on this deeper in the end, but we can go ahead and look at it now. So we'll go ahead and click in here as it loads. As you can see here, within the Google Cloud community, our cloud forum itself, we've got our own security community. As we can see here, maybe this is how you actually found our event today. It's the reCAPTCHA Enterprise Onboarding. Potentially you have questions around getting started with Chronicle, other areas. Within this community, you can ask questions, right? We see that their question was asked here, an account linked to the wrong project. But I think kind of the foundational area of the community itself is open-ended collaboration. So it's maybe not a question that Kindergarten could directly answer for you. Maybe it's not a question that you should take to support. Maybe you can't find the answer within a Google Cloud documentation article. But the community itself is a vastly growing network of customers, internal stakeholders, partners, kind of that are out there actually in the field using the project or the product, implementing it. And they're the ones that kind of can be, cast a wider net for support on questions around potential best practices. Maybe there's a security type question, or maybe there's an API type question you have. The community itself is a great line of defense for questions like that and or learnings. So, we can learn from questions that others are asking out there. So now I'm actually going to pass it over to Kendrick to talk about some enterprise key onboarding phases.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So just kind of hopping on this here, as Nick said, I'm Kendrick A. So I operate on the reCAPTCHA Enterprise team and help a lot of customers with these types of onboarding. So at least for me, I'm used to having a lot of these conversations live and talking with a lot of our customers here, obviously this being either potentially recorded or live stream. So feel free to interact in the chat. If you guys have some questions, we'll circle back to those, or even just let us know where you're from or where you're at in terms of your reCAPTCHA journey if you're already operating in that capacity here. But what I'll do is touch on a little bit of what to expect when you're expecting, right? So obviously one of the first questions the customer will ask us is, what have I gotten into in terms of getting reCAPTCHA implemented here? And actually, the implementation is relatively simple. And not only that, it can kind of meet you where you are. So one of the first questions that you tend to ask is going to be in line with that, right? Meaning with this being a security as a service API, one of the first questions you want to ask is, how am I going to handle the authentication to the backend piece? So with that said, you have a couple of options. You can either use an API key, or you can use our service account. So the only real question there is whether or not you allow for external authentication. If you do, great, you can use our service accounts and go ahead and get started as it's saying here in the second prompt. Otherwise, you can just leverage our API key in that instance there. But that's the first step, is essentially making that established concept as to how you're going to handle that backend authentication. Getting installed and configured. As Nick said, we have a lot of documentation. I work on that team to help get some of that documentation out to you guys. as well as FAQs and things of that sort. The community is also definitely a great resource for any gaps that you might have that you might not quite understand in special use cases. But that documentation is very robust, and it has lots of sample code, things of that sort to kind of get you started with exactly how you're going to implement this here. But with that said, once you've made the decision on how to implement it and where to implement it, you're looking at creating site keys. The site key is essentially going to be associated with the actual reCAPTCHA challenge that you're going to be using, as well as a few other things that we can touch on here. But when you're setting up your site key specifically, meaning where you want reCAPTCHA to evaluate the traffic, you're going to be looking at either setting up a score-based key, which is going to be one of the newer ones, the version 3 that we have, as well as the one that a lot of people are familiar with the checkbox or the visual challenge, where you have to select the items and the images and things of that sort. So once you've decided what kind of actual reCAPTCHA challenge you want, and you've gone ahead and implemented that at any of these points that you want to protect, and essentially protected actions that you want to assess, like login, account creation, things to that effect. At that point in time, that's essentially kind of where the fun part comes in, right? So what we typically tell our customers and clients is that when you're creating an assessment, as noted here, the idea is that you're essentially saying, hey, reCAPTCHA, you've looked at some of the behavior on my site. I would like to kind of go ahead and get that score back so I can decide how I want to do that bot mitigation on the other end here. And as this little sample shows you, you're essentially dealing in a JSON request and a response. And so the idea is we're want to simplify as best as we can any place that we can. And so any information that you're going to get back from the various features that you use reCAPTCHA with are going to be within that JSON response. And so that includes the score. We have an example of that here, as well as a few other features that come with reCAPTCHA if you guys look to implement that. But all of that is encompassed in what we call the assessment here. So you can hop to the next slide, Nick. So interpreting the assessment here. As I said before, reCAPTCHA has kind of come a long ways. What everyone's familiar with is the version 2, wherein you're kind of picking those images. Version 3 is very transparent to the user, and so they're not running into that user friction and those challenges. And so, with it being more of an intelligence tool to be able to guide exactly how you want to implement your bot mitigation, there does come the factor of interpreting that assessment, right? So if I'm getting a score between 0 and 10. What would I do with the 10? Well, if it's 10 being a high risk and 0 being a low risk, obviously you want to then take that 10 as a high risk to decide I'm going to make certain types of mitigation in that user's path. Maybe I want to stop that user outright, or if they're low risk, allow them to continue forward, or maybe in the middle, just give them some type of a redemption path, like multi-factor authentication or two-factor or something to that effect. So basically the sky's the limit at that point in time. Identifying the bots is the hard part. The fun part is when you get to decide what you need to do once you have identified those bots. And so interpreting those assessments is essentially a matter of, as I tell clients, deciding what path you want to take. I've seen a lot of really interesting implementations of that in terms of what some of our clients have decided to do once they actually have that bot identified. So that said, the next phase of that being the annotating of an assessment. So the concept here is essentially saying, when you're getting these scores back from reCAPTCHA, there might be instances where you're seeing behavior in your traffic that might be a little bit different from what you would typically think to expect in this sense. Like, for example, people are using VPNs a lot more nowadays. We want you to have visibility on that type of information, so it will be something that shows up in the score, but maybe in certain instances you say, you know what, this is fine. I want to go ahead and train the model to allow it to not flag on any types of events of this sort. And so annotating the assessment is going to be a great way to do that. You have a direct line into engineering to essentially say, I want to flag this as legitimate or flag this as fraudulent. So it completes that cycle in terms of being able to improve the site-specific model that you guys are looking at that reCAPTCHA uses to score these particular types of users or bots. And in terms of production and going live, anyone who has actually had to support a product knows that anyone who is having to test things in production live is usually a no-no, but if you got to do it, you got to do it. However, reCAPTCHA doesn't fall to a lot of those issues, because one of the beauties of setting up reCAPTCHA is that you can set it up in production without taking action immediately. So what that means is you're configuring reCAPTCHA to look at actual traffic in your environment without actually having to take action on it, and thus you are able to make educated decisions on exactly how you want to place those assessments and how you want to take those mitigating steps. And so really it's a very seamless process in terms of setting up and going live in that regard. And in regards to monitoring and support, obviously at that point in time, you're leveraging the same thing that you would be using during deployment, which is when you're going into the GCP console itself, you have access to all the logs in terms of assessments and any other information that we have on our end. And so you can set up through the actual console different graphs of tools or different data over time to take a look at exactly how those assessments are trending over time, what kind of threats you're looking at over time, how many executes, things to that effect. And so in that regard, when you're reviewing that, if you're running into problems or certain issues, or you're spotting certain trends that are concerning through support, you're able to kind of engage and look at those particular issues and troubleshoot certain problems that you're having. And with this being a GCP service, you are able to engage directly through our GCP support as well, and that loops you in automatically with people like me and others that are already very familiar with the tool and able to kind of help guide you guys in terms of your journey here. So that's it. Nick, if you want to take it up.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Kendrick. I think that key onboarding phase and what you talked through there is some of the meat and bones of today's conversation. Next is what I'll talk about is a bit about our enterprise documentation and support. I've covered a bit of this already, but I think one thing we want to do here is capture the essence of how impactful, the documentation and support is. So kind of diving back into the documentation component of it, as we can see here, what we've got highlighted is kind of within that actual kind of the documentation itself is these guides. So these are the developer guides. I touched on these a bit in the beginning of the conversation, but I think the key takeaway here is kind of from the documentation itself. People like Kendrick and those teams have really put together these extremely thorough guides on kind of a lot of the features, functionality, setup, security, all that fun stuff within reCAPTCHA. That you can dive into here. So like I mentioned before, I can go back into this and show you, do a little show and tell here. But in terms of some of the guides, there's, the guides panel here at the top. We can go here on the left. Let's say, I'm a user, I've used reCAPTCHA in the past, but I'm kind of want to make sure that I'm detecting and preventing account takeovers. It's a new little wrinkle or something that I want to dive back into. So from here, you can go into that guide and kind of dive deeper on the actual topic itself. You can see that this is pretty thorough. It's got a bit of the code itself. It's got the using scores and custom challenges like Kendrick mentioned, but more or less like use these guides is a very robust resource, especially in the implementation phase or kind of the how-to phase. And when you're looking into the theoreticals around, how should I set this up? What do I want this like go live or ultimately that finished product to look like? These guides themselves really are a key component of that process in terms of kind of your implementation and setup. As you can see here, we're kind of doubling down on those guides as a great resource. Again, on the right, it just kind of tells you how to get there. Then the next is accessing the latest support offerings. So Kendrick mentioned this before, but kind of access to the support resources, the experts in the field, and kind of both the back end and some of the support channels that you're typically provided. In terms of how to get to this, again, we can see this one is the red box. You can navigate to that via that panel in this window itself. As you can see on the left, from a support perspective, you can see all support, getting support, and billing information. Use this support team like a typical support function that you would use, right? In terms of maybe you're stuck, maybe you have a security concern, maybe you have an ask on, is this the right thing to do or right thing to set up? Also from a billing perspective, obviously money and all of that is always top of mind, and we want to make sure that you're getting the support in that sense, so that billing information is within that same support panel. So use the support team, no question is necessarily too small or too big. Obviously they have some things that some guidelines around, the questions they can field and all of that, but use that support team alongside the community kind of as your first line of defense for questions, concerns, potentially, something within the code to dive into kind of either how to troubleshoot them or ultimately how to get your instance and or the go live or setup to a better spot. So I'll now pass it back to Kendrick to address a few of the FAQs.
Yeah, so in terms of the FAQ, this is one of the documentations that's very much a living document in that we are constantly updating it. We're putting other information because obviously the frequently asked questions are going to change over time. So the idea being when you go to the same URL, as Nick said, we're going to provide that to you guys here as a follow-up. However, once you do go to this document, you can click on resource at the top and then take you over to the frequently asked questions. That's going to cover a number of different topics that we see a lot of people running into. For example, if you want to go to the next slide here, Nick. So for example, one of the questions that get asked a lot is, how many domains can I list under? So when I'm opening up the GCP console and I am creating my first site key, if I am going to be setting up domains under that, do I have any kind of limiting factors in terms of that regard? So currently, the only limit in terms of technically speaking is 250. When we recommend for customers exactly how they might want to iterate through that, typically that will stem towards more along the lines of how they're using reCAPTCHA, how they're leveraging it, what type of traffic that they're looking at in terms of how many domains they actually want to have referenced with the site key. However, just in terms of how many you can put in there, 250 is the limit there. But that said, the other factor that we see here, obviously google.com as a domain has certain environments where it might not be accessible or resolvable. And so with that, we do actually have a reCAPTCHA.net domain. And so any instances within your code, or you have that reference, like for example, with the actual render link that you guys will see once you see, but that's the example that we have here. Within that context, if you have any google.com URLs, you can just plug in that reCAPTCHA.net if you're having problems. And oddly enough, that solves a lot of the problems that end up coming to my desk every once in a while. Obviously, I like the big, juicy, interesting ones that kind of dig deep into any particular types of bugs. But in lieu of seeing those very often, some of the ones I do see often is, oh, wait, why aren't we able to see this or get access to that? 9 times out of 10, maybe we're going through a hop that does not allow that google.com domain. So that's one of the ones that, like I said, that I'll see relatively frequently that I can address fairly easily. But again, that data is available for you guys as well in the FAQ. So keep an eye on that because it does change. Next slide here. So in terms of pricing, what I will recommend is obviously definitely reach out to a cloud sales team for any particular use cases that you want to explore. However, generally speaking, me as a technical resource, I will tell you that pricing essentially comes down to the assessment that we mentioned before, right? So essentially what you're paying for is the assessment. You're not paying for anything else other than that in that regard. And so the idea is you're setting up reCAPTCHA, you're telling it, hey, I want it to look at my traffic here. I want it to learn my traffic. I want to improve the accuracy of the scores while it's looking at this traffic. But you are not charged until you actually make an actual assessment that calls back to Google and says, let me go ahead and get that score. Or as I said before, any number of other features that are bundled with that. Beyond that, you are looking at a $1 per 1,000 calls, and the first 1 million are zero cost. And that includes whether you're using the zero cost version or if you're upscaling to enterprise as a business. The first 1 million are going to be zero cost to you. Any beyond that, as indicated here, are going to come under certain guidelines. But as I said before, definitely reach out to your cloud sales team to get more details about maybe how we can customize some of that usage for your particular needs in any particular scenario you're looking at.
Awesome. Thanks, Kendrick. Yeah, I'll take it back for kind of our last section here before we dive into the Q&A and provide some kind of follow-up resources and some takeaways for the call. So again, a lot of what I'm covering here today is kind of doubling down on the resources, the support channels, ultimately the community. I think, as we can see here, the beautiful words of an innovative, trusted, and vibrant hub for customers to find answers, make meaningful connections, share ideas, and build skills. So really, the community itself is that it's fostering collaboration, it's fostering that connections, idea sharing, ultimately kind of driving your skill set forward. We call out 3 specific, action items here. The product discussion forums. So like any product, software, hardware, whatever it is, kind of your feedback is important to us, making sure that, your voice is being heard ultimately within kind of the product itself. What are you longing for? What is your business? What are your business needs that could really, by us adding or changing something, kind of what does that look like from the product side? We really want to hear from you. And that's a great place also to kind of go to discuss, kind of collaborate with, other customers or potentially what else others are looking for to get out of the product itself. So the product discussion forum, it's a huge component of it for us, both internally to make sure we're supporting you and ingesting your ideas, but at the same time for you, go ask questions, go, collaborate with others, kind of connect with those like-minded individuals that might have, similar questions or ideas that they're looking for from the product itself. The next is our community blogs. So this is kind of areas that like our leadership, technical content, people like Kendrick and or product and engineering, where they kind of support and kind of provide these blogs themselves. These could be around how-tos, they could be around a use case, they could be on a customer story, but more or less like these community blogs are, a nice pre-configured shape package of something that is kind of ultimately should be shared with the community. And the last is the AMA or quick takes. So within there, there's a long list there of technical resources, product managers, OPMs, CSMs, CEs that will kind of directly interact with the customers kind of on the cue the questions type series. There's also quick takes, which are, quick hit videos on that kind of highlight product features, product launches, and events in under 10 minutes. Obviously, we all live in a day and age where we ingest content very quickly or in short form. So those 10-minute kind of videos or less than 10-minute videos are very digestible. They're very supportive, like watching a 3-minute YouTube video on how to change something as opposed to reading through, the documentation itself. If that's kind of how you learn, there's a great series on that also. So quickly kind of on how to use a security community. As we can see here, I've taken you to like actually inside this landing page. This is taking you back to the 30,000 foot view of the Google Cloud community itself. As you simply go to this page, googlecloudcommunity.com, very aptly named, you can hit that log in and or to ask a question. Log in to ask a question. Basically, that's kind of the register page. That's kind of your key to entry to the community itself. Creating an account, I think all of us are fairly familiar with how to do this. You can log in with your Google account, so it's all linked, but more or less kind of just, setting up the account is pretty similar to anything we do out there. And then navigating to it, I won't show you this video because it's pretty simple, but as you can see here, kind of navigate back to that Google Cloud community. Now that you have access, you can scroll down to the security button, and then you can use the search bar there, start a conversation, collaborate with Kendrick and myself, other customers, look at guides, things like that. So again, kind of this community, if there's, a couple of key takeaways here, this is definitely one of them that, get involved in that community, get engaged with other customers, on security products, reCAPTCHA, and engaging kind of in a collaborative sense. So that's kind of it for the actual content today. So kind of next steps, key takeaways for this conversation would be, again, kind of sign up for the community, start to search there, kind of see what questions people are asking, the videos, kind of digest, the information there. The second, familiar yourself with kind of the support documentation, maybe if you're at the very beginning stages, understanding your pricing or just understanding kind of some of that technical setup. There's hundreds of hours or thousands of hours of documentation out there that's been kind of poured into from product engineering, kind of our field teams themselves to help kind of you provide that one-to-many type of support. And then the last thing, Kendrick has mentioned this multiple times, but create your first assessment, kind of actually dive in and get started there. So that's it for the actual content itself. I'm going to navigate back and I'll stop presenting here, stop my screen. Awesome. It doesn't look like there's any questions as of now.
Sounds like we did a good job of covering it.
Perfect. But yeah, well, Kendrick and I will stay on for a few more minutes here. Feel free to ask any questions. If you do have any questions after the event, again, engage on the community, go to your support team, go to your account team for questions like that. After the event, we'll send a follow-up of the resources here that we've talked through today. And outside of that, we look forward to working with you, either one-on-one or in forums like the community itself.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I will make note here while we give you guys some time to possibly put some questions in reference to that FAQ about some of those frequently asked questions. One of the frequently asked ones that we get is customers going, wait, what is V3? Meaning everyone's super familiar with the V2 implementation with the checkbox and the visual challenge, but very often I'll tell them, oh yeah, we have one that does not require you to check a box. And they're very surprised to hear about that. And so that's usually one of the first questions that I'll get from a customer. And just clarifying it here, as I said before, is that V2, you have that user friction where the user is having to click a box or make some type of interaction. V3, we take that away. It's completely transparent and on the back end, so that user does not have to go through any type of user friction, no type of challenge. reCAPTCHA is able to essentially review that user's journey or the behavior and provide a score straight to the back end. So that's one of the big questions that I get quite often, that people are very surprised because, again, while very useful and very ubiquitous tool, you see it all over the internet. If it ain't broke, don't fix it type of mentality typically in the in certain spaces there. And so people don't really look out and realize that some of these different features are available. So that's one that I definitely get fairly often. So again, as we've said before, if you guys do have questions and you start playing around maybe with the V3 implementation in terms of all the different features that offers, for sure, reach out to the community, reach out to your sales team. If you have some questions about that, we are happy to address them in any capacity at all.
Awesome, appreciate that. I think obviously you get a lot of questions kind of in the early stages here, so any input there is appreciated.
Yep.
Awesome, it doesn't look like there's any other questions. Any other kind of top of mind things or FAQs or high-level questions that you can think of, Kendrick, before we call this a day?
Oh, I could go for days, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, no, I mean, geez. I would say that one of the beauties of this tool is the fact that even in its simplistic nature, it's a very powerful tool. The bot landscape has changed drastically from back in like 2007 when they were having issues with just OCR technology being able to read the spine of the book, right? That's one of the things that the challenge for reCAPTCHA was about, So now they have no problems with that. They can identify all the cats on the internet and all these other things and mimic humans very well. And so that's one of the reasons why we made that shift from V2 to V3, making it transparent, because in a lot of ways, bots are gotten a little bit too smart for some of those implementations. So the fit sounds great in certain instances, and the V3 implementation is a good fit in other instances. So that's some of the conversation that we have with customers in terms of which instance they should use which version in. But again, if you engage us at any point in time, we can take a look at that and help you guys out.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely different than seeing what the bridges or the roads or the street signs, right?
Yes. My wife has most definitely, that was the first thing she identified when I said, hey, I'm going to be working on the reCAPTCHA enterprise team. Typically, she's not super technical. Immediately, she said, oh, you mean that thing where I have to choose the buses and I was like, yeah. Sometimes I just forget. It's all over the place. So everybody's familiar with it.
Awesome. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we can call it a day. Kendrick and I will send a follow-up on kind of the resource guides. Feel free to ask any questions on this YouTube link after, this broadcast. This is a living and breathing link itself. Feel free to ask questions there. And like we've talked about before, engage your account teams, ask support, engage on the community. Ultimately, kind of, we're here to support you all and want to make sure you're getting kind of the best information, not only at your implementation, but kind of before your implementation, that you're making the right decisions with the tool, with your pricing setup, or just even understanding the lay of the land of the product and as it's evolved, like Kendrick mentioned with V3. So reach out. We look forward to working with you all in the future, and look forward to kind of engaging both on the community questions here and on future type sessions that we might have coming down the line with reCAPTCHA.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody joining.
Awesome. Have a good one, Kendrick.
Later, guys.